to all of you who have been able to come really today under the current circumstances. And I have to say it's really good to see you after such a long time. So thanks for each and every one of you for being with us here today. Now, this afternoon we are going to hear from the Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, including its causes and consequences, Mr. Tomoya Obokata. He will share with you some of the preliminary findings during his visit to Sri Lanka. Now, Mr. Obokata arrived in Sri Lanka on the 26th of November, and this is actually his first country visit since his appointment to his mandate in March 2020. As a special rapporteur, as you all know, Mr. Obokata is independent from any government or organization, including the UN, but he reports only to the United Nations Human Rights Council. So he is a Japanese scholar on international law and human rights, specializing in transnational organized crimes, human trafficking, modern slavery, and he resides in the United Kingdom. We are thankful for the Sri Lankan authorities for inviting Mr. Obokata, and also it's good to remind all of you that since 2015, Sri Lanka has received around 11 visits related to different mandates of the Special Rapporteur of Human Rights Council. Now, the human rights or the Special Rapporteur mandate links directly to Article 4 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that states that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude, and that slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Slavery, incidentally, is one of the first human rights issues to arouse wide international concern, yet it still continues. Slavery-like practices also remain a serious and unresolved problems in all parts of the world and in every single country, unfortunately. The majority of those who suffer are always the poorest, most vulnerable, and marginalized social groups. Fear, lack of knowledge about their rights, impunity, and the need to survive discourage them from speaking up and for reaching out. The Special Rapporteur, in his visit, he has examined some practices and some labor conditions in various economic sectors, including the garment industry, the tea plantations, domestic work, sex work, and work performed by migrants here in Sri Lanka and by Sri Lankans migrants abroad, which might amount to varying degrees of exploitation. Sustainable Development Goal, Target 8.7, requires states to take immediate, effective measures to eradicate forced labor and end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025, end child labor in all its forms. This is what SDG 8.7 states. Sri Lanka is a pathfinder country under the multi-stakeholder platform Alliance 8.7, which coordinates implementation of SDG target 8.7, which means that Sri Lanka has committed to accelerating action in ending slavery, trafficking, child labor in all its forms. The Special Rapporteur will present a comprehensive report on his visit at the 51st session of the Human Rights Council to be held in September 2022. The report's findings can support the government to strengthen mechanisms to enhance labor conditions in key sectors in the country. And I want to underline that these findings are to support the government to strengthen mechanisms to enhance labor conditions in key sectors in the country. The UN in Sri Lanka, inclusive of its agencies, funds, and programs, will implement the recommendations of the Special Rapporteur in future programming to ensure and promote safer and fairer employment practices and decent work in all sectors in Sri Lanka. We will also work to ensure that Sri Lankan migrant laborers and work abroad have access to the necessary socio-economic and institutional support from all stakeholders. The Special Rapporteur, Mr. Tomoya Obokata, will now present his findings. Therefore, colleagues, you are invited to ask Mr. Obokata any question you may have pertaining to his visit, and invite you now to present your finding, Mr. Obokata.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for coming to this press conference. And my name is Tomoya Obokata. I am the current United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery. Now, I'd like to begin by thanking the government of Sri Lanka for inviting me since last week to conduct my mission. And I've had a very constructive engagement with a number of departments, ranging from the law enforcement offices, Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and as well as Attorney General Office and others. And we had a frank and constructive dialogue with government public officials. And I also like to thank other stakeholders, such as civil society organizations, trade unions, and other human rights defenders, as well as workers themselves whom I have been able to meet during my visit, and I have been able to receive first-hand information on what the situation is in different parts of this country. And as the resident coordinator has explained, my job is to assess the working conditions in various key sectors, which are potentially a display element of slavery, forced labor, and servitude. And since last week, I have visited Kandy district and visited plantations. And I've also made a trip to the free trade zone and met with workers as well as the management. And we also had consultation with the business community in apparel and other industries. And based on the information I received, so I have met over 100 stakeholders since last week, so which has been quite intense, but it's very productive visit. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone, the government and other stakeholders. Now, I'd like to start I'd like to share some of the findings, key findings, but I'd like to start by the positive aspects that I've discovered through my mission. First, Sri Lanka is one of the countries enlisted as the pathfinder country, as explained by the resident coordinator. So this in itself demonstrates its commitment to tackle forced labor, slavery, servitude, and particularly child labor, which is one of the areas the government has been taking enormous progress. One example I can give you is this pilot project called a Child Labor Free Zone, which was implemented in Ratnapura, I'm sorry if I mispronounced, Ratnapura district in 2013. Now, the government has worked intensely with relevant stakeholders such as parents, teachers, trade unions, and businesses in order to raise awareness, and also come up with a child protection plan. And since that time, and a few years later, the government was successful in reducing the instances of child labor by 60%. This is an impressive result. And the government has also taken other steps to prevent child labor, for example, raising the minimum age from 14 to 16 this year, January this year, which is, in my mind, a very positive step. This is also in line with the compulsory education age of 16, as you may know. And also the government has updated its list of so-called hazardous work, where you are prohibited from working in these sectors until 18 years of age. And one of the contentious issues here was domestic work. That means working in private homes. Because compared to other sectors like garment and plantation and so on, domestic sector has been least regulated. So something like minimum wage, working hours, access to benefits have not been as strong as other sectors. And one of the things the government has done is to update this list and include domestic work as part of the hazardous list. So anyone under the age of 18 now should not be working in that sector. And that has been published in the official gazette in November. And I regard that to be a good practice. And government has also taken wider measures in addition to child labor. For example, updating the penal code to include new offenses of human trafficking and other related offenses in line with international standards. For example, the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And also, now one of the issues that I will be discussing in a moment is issues of microfinancing, particularly affecting women in rural and poor areas, whereby women get a loan in order to sustain themselves and so on. That has become a very acute problem in this country because these microfinancing companies are charging a very high amount of interest, somewhere like 20 to 30% each week. So that women end up having to pay, a lot more than that they have borrowed. So the government is introducing or considering a legislation to tighten their regulation on microfinancing. And as well as this major issue is employment, migration for employment. And this has been a good tradition of Sri Lankan nationals to migrate abroad for employment. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think other countries in the neighboring Asia, for example, Philippines, Bangladesh and so on, they also have migrants. But one of the issues there was the regulation or protection of workers in that kind of setting. So I've been hearing stories I've spoken to a number of migrant workers, returnees, and they were saying, for example, that they have been abused and exploited, for example, in the Middle East, working as domestic workers. Now, obviously, these countries have the primary obligation to protect these workers, but Sri Lankan government is equally responsible for their nationals, so they have to make sure that their nationals are being protected, safely reintegrated, returned to these countries. And government, I'm pleased to see that I'm encouraged by some of the efforts taken by the government, for example, regulating so-called sub-agents, which provides false information, charge high amount of fees, and sometimes ask for sexual favors and traffic these vulnerable victims to different parts of the world. So they are tightening up their regulations. And finally, I was very much encouraged by the proactive or the strong presence of trade unions in these countries. Many of them do work for the rights of workers in different sectors, and I've had a number of consultations since last week and met with a number of trade union representatives, and then I was very pleased to see that they are actually fighting for the rights of workers in different sectors. And to add, we also have so-called civil society organizations. They are mainly human rights organizations, but many of them actually do focus on issues relating to slavery, forced labor, and rights of workers. So I think these are the positive examples that I've seen, and these are to be shared widely, not just within Sri Lanka, but also to the neighboring countries and elsewhere, so that other countries can learn from the experience of the Sri Lankan government. Now, having said that, I have also identified a number of areas that need to be addressed in order to fully prevent and suppress forced labor, slavery, servitude, and more importantly, to protect the victims of these practices. Now, it is a clear fact that contemporary forms of slavery continue to exist in this country. And during my visit, I was focusing on particularly vulnerable populations, starting, for example, with children. Now, according to the government, it's only about 1% of children are in child labor, which may not be as many, but still is a problem because most of these children work in hazardous work, so physically demanding, dangerous, and sometimes dirty, so 3D jobs. And that this has been particularly exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic because of the school closures in the past 18 months or so. They are not learning, and some of them have online learning, which is fine, but and I've also visited rural areas where children didn't even have access to internet and other technical means to access education. Then oftentimes that happens not just in this country, but elsewhere, is that they stay at home and maybe they're encouraged by their parents to help them earn living. And I have received first-hand information from various sectors, families, workers, trade unions, and so on, that some of the children have had to work during the COVID-19 pandemic in, for example, domestic work, hospitality, hotel, and other sectors. So that is an area of concern. Now, also the child labor free zone, I think that is an example of good practice that has attracted actually attention from different countries. For example, South Africa and other countries are looking into this particular model. But since it's a pilot project, this project has not been rolled out to the rest of the country. And I am recommending the government to take a step further to implement the same project to the rest of the country so the children are truly free from child labor. Another particular vulnerable group is, of course, women. I witnessed that women and girls are disproportionately affected by contemporary forms of slavery, which is closely interlinked to significant levels of gender inequality, patriarchal attitudes, and intersecting forms of discrimination. Certain sectors such as plantations, domestic work, and garment sectors, many of which are characterized by demanding working conditions, are predominantly occupied by women, further increasing the risk of vulnerability and exploitation. Just to give you an example, I learned when I visited Kandy last weekend that women have to work twice as long to earn the same amount of daily wage of 1,000 rupees a day. So men typically work for about 4 or 5 hours to earn that, but women have to work twice as long. There's a daily target, for example, if women have to pluck somewhere between 18 to 22 kilograms of tea leaves to earn 1,000 rupees. And if they don't, their wages are cut. And the same kind of targets, achieving target is serving as enormous pressure on women in sector as garment. So many of these factories have target. You have to produce this 100 clothing an hour, and if you don't, perhaps you do not get bonus, and so on. So women are perhaps unnecessarily being penalized. And as I said, also the system of microfinancing has become particularly problematic for women because these companies actually target women as an easy prey. And they provide information contract, for example, in English, the language that they don't understand. And women oftentimes have no choice but to sign it without fully understanding what's involved and the interest rate and so on, and spiral out of control. And I've heard cases of, in order to repay their debt, they have to resort to sex work, selling themselves, and sometimes even selling their children into sex work. And I find that extremely disturbing. And also sometimes these microfinancing companies are reportedly connected to these sub-agents which facilitate migration abroad. So what happens then is microfinancing companies repay their debts, but in return, they have to migrate for employment. So there is that vicious cycle of exploitation and abuse by these private entities, which I am very much alarmed in that setting. So I have also made a series of recommendations to deal with this microfinancing company, and the government has informed me today, actually, that they are dealing with it. They are introducing some type of legislative amendment to ensure that these companies are properly regulated, along with the sub-agents, which have previously not been actually regulated at all. So I think those are the good aspects. And I also paid attention to older workers or retired workers. In the plantation sector, for example, the vast majority of workers are over the age of 50. So they're not that, because young people tend to work outside of plantations, for example, in domestic work and so on. And you can imagine the demanding tasks with an increasing age. Many of these tasks become even more demanding and tiring, plucking teas for 8 to 10 hours every day if you are 55. Imagine that. And that's putting enormous mental and physical strain on them. But many of these workers do not even have to, as I said, sub-agents who are not regulated. They charge fees, they exploit these migrant workers, and then when they have issues, for example, in the Middle East, they cannot go to the embassies. Why? Because they are not properly registered. So if you are registered, there's an insurance scheme, there is a pre-departure briefing and training, and there's also reintegration program. And sometimes they get grants. I think these are good system, I have to say, but if you are not registered, you get to have none of those. And there's an increasing number of migrant workers facing that situation. So I believe there is a strong, again, scope for improvement in that area. As I said, well, in addition to about ethnic dimensions, we also have heard stories of the so-called caste-based discrimination, which may exist in certain society. I'm not here to say that it is widespread problems, but we have been speaking to a number of interlocutors explaining some of the situations. For example, once again, access to education, discrimination at workplace. So for example, the promotion prospect is much lower for those belonging to a lower class or caste. And also most of these higher positions in the senior management are from the dominant class or caste. So again, there's lots of like intersecting causes, reasons. So it is not as quite simple. And so all of these causes are kind of working together to put certain sectors of society more vulnerable to these practices. But once again, this is not just to blame or criticize Sri Lanka. This happens in many parts of the world, but since I am here to visit the country situation, I am making certain recommendations so that the government and the international community and someone like myself could work with to work to prevent and suppress contemporary forms of slavery. And as I said, a while ago, I said I was encouraged by the strong presence of trade unions and civil society sectors working for the rights of workers. But unfortunately, I have heard, again, first-hand information from a large number of trade unions, civil society organizations, as well as workers, that many of them are being monitored, harassed. And so there's this idea about many of them have expressed some concerns about shrinking civic space where these organizations can work together to protect the rights of workers and to prevent contemporary forms of slavery. Now, obviously, government has its own positions, but I'm simply stating what I have seen and what I have heard from a wide variety of sources backed up by independent research that I have conducted prior to my visit. And so these are kind of specific groups. And just before concluding, I also have a general observation. So for example, many of these sectors indeed do pay more than the minimum wage. That is fine, but many workers actually have said that that's not enough. Even 1,000 rupee is not enough to support a family of 4 or 5, because these wages do not necessarily take rising cost of living or inflation into consideration. And I'm sure that actually happens in every single sector. It's not just limited to the sector that I visited. Whether you work in an office, whether you work in the press, whether you work in the government, inflation is the key. But if the minimum wage is not rising, and all workers are suffering from that. So my certainly recommendation is to take appropriate action to take that into consideration and regularly update the minimum wage so that all workers can enjoy decent standard of living without discrimination. Another area that has been expressed as a concern is lack of labor inspections, particularly in rural areas. Now, labor inspection normally happens like these inspectors go to workplaces, inspect living and working conditions, and make necessary recommendations in order to improve the situation. And I do take a point of the government that yes, government apparently it does like 80,000, for example, inspections annually, which is quite a few numbers, which has been actually once again been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is an unfortunate situation, which I really cannot blame. Lockdown, you have to stay at home, so that means the inspection could not happen. And that actually was the case in majority of the countries in the world, not just Sri Lanka. So I do sympathize with that. But in the particularly remote areas and the inspection, what I have heard from all these interlocutors is that the inspection do not actually happen. So there is no prospect to complain. So even if they were in this kind of situations, there's no one to turn to. And sometimes in these ethnic minority communities, although the official languages are Tamil and Sinhala, sometimes these workers are finding it difficult to speak in Tamil in certain areas, and perhaps because officers are not trained enough or for other reasons. So these are things that we have heard directly from those affected. Obviously, the official line is that these are two languages. So police officers are trained to speak, but one reason or another, this may not be happening in some parts of the country. And that I also wanted to raise. And finally, again, as I said, that related to that is access to justice and remedies. And there's not, again, there are avenues to complain, labor inspectorate, labor tribunals, and so on. And sometimes I think it's not necessarily the fault of the, well, I mean, in a sense of that, I mean, they have established these mechanisms, but the fact that many of these workers are not actually complaining can suggest that there's something there. And one of which I found is the lack of information given to workers, particularly in the rural areas. Now, it may be easy to say that, okay, everything is on a website, and you can go to the local office, but that's not always possible for many of these workers. Many of them don't even have an internet access in remote areas. So these are the kind of things that are making it difficult to access information. Access to information is a key in everything, not just in my area, right to work. It is key in getting adequate standard of living and healthcare and so on. So I think there may be a scope to increase that type, that access to information and so on. So these are some of the initial findings I've heard, I've discovered, and I'm just willing to share with you. Then I think you will be provided with a statement in full and also recommendations. So this is just a 5,000 words initial findings. I am due to present a full report of twice as long, 10,000 words, next year to the Human Rights Council. So, and all the information plus additional research that I will be doing between now and then, and also additional information to be received from the government, because there may be lots of developments between now and then. So I'd like to present a report which is as accurate as possible. So I will be continuing constructive dialogue and engagement with various public sectors that I've met, law enforcement and authorities, labor ministry, ministry of plantations, and housing and women and children. But once again, I'd like to say that I was very encouraged by the level of engagement by the government. They are very frank, and they were willing to meet with me, exchanging frank and honest views, and I very much appreciate their cooperation during this visit. So I'd like to thank them once again, and also thank everyone that I met for sharing information, exchanging frank views, and as well as you, member of press, for taking an interest in this issue. And I do hope that you can convey this message, that this is an issue in Sri Lanka, and as much as in other countries, and that I do hope to be able to work with the Sri Lankan government and other members of civil society and so on to prevent and suppress contemporary forms of slavery. So I will finish there. Thank you very much, and I will be very happy to take any questions that you may have for the next half an hour or so. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Obokata. Colleagues? Yeah, yes, please, please.
Yeah.
I will give you a couple of them where women committed suicide. If you could tell us a little more as to where did you find this sort of sexual favors they were asking, we could highlight them.
Well, yes, but thank you. So my issue of microfinancing and how that is impacting on women. I've also heard that there's unfortunate cases of suicide as well, because they have no other choice. And sexual favors, I've heard the story of like women, again, microfinancing agents asking for sexual favor in return for relaxing, for example, repayment for a month.
Have you visited any places where they were told?
No, I mean, we've requested meetings, but unfortunately, I've not been able to meet any, and I suspect that they probably wouldn't want to see me investigating. But there are also women resorting to sex work and other work in order to repay the debt that they can never actually repay, and that's a vicious cycle there. Yes, sir.
My name is Steve. I'm from the Island newspaper.
Okay.
I don't know if you have any knowledge about what the Plantation Human Development Trust has done on the plantations. Now, you are speaking about line rooms. Yes, there are, or there were, 158,000 line rooms in the plantations. But effective from the Dutch government, they had the Plantation Trust. And these housing was replaced by up to about 20%, giving them good houses with toilets and water facilities and so on.
Yeah.
So that amount of Dutch aid which came to us at that time was effective in the plantations.
Thank you.
So your assumption that they are not in good living conditions is not quite correct. I hope you don't mind me telling you that. But that is the factual situation of what did happen, subject to the inputs of the Plantation Human Development Trust, which was Dutch government aid, with also inputs from the Sri Lankan government.
Thank you.
I have a few more questions.
Okay.
But
can I answer that question
Yes,
first? Well, I also have to mention that the Indian government has provided some funding to build houses. And I think it is right to recognize that some families have been able to benefit, but has that happened to the majority? The government itself has acknowledged that there's more to go. So what I said is correct. The majority of the people are still living in that kind of condition. Some people have been fortunate to be able to live in those better housing, but if you compare the ratio, still the vast majority of them are living in that kind of unfortunate situation. So I don't think I provided any false information in that regard. Go on.
You also mentioned about human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Now, all of what you just complained about is more relevant to the Middle East and not to us, because Middle East have women working there and they're completely exploited. Now, have you got any comments on that, please?
Yes, that's again wrong, because Sri Lankan people are being trafficked from here to the Middle East. So it is not a problem of Middle East. This is the people working here, trafficking. People working here, forcing women to engage in sex work. So it is a Sri Lankan problem. So your answer, again, I have to disagree.
Just one more question.
Sure.
You also mentioned that if a plucker does not pluck the required number of kilos per day, her wages are cut. That is not quite correct. They're not correct at all. You can't stop her wages at all. And if she does not pluck the required poundage, well, she has to be paid. If she plucks more than that, she gets something in the region of 120, quite a lot more as overpounds. So even that assumption that you have just come up with is not quite correct. I hope you don't mind me telling you that.
Sure, it's not assumption. I've spoken to workers. They told me that. So it is correct. I'm not saying that this happens to every single plantation. I think that would be incorrect. And I'm sure that many, in plantation, they get paid. But people that I've spoken to, they clearly told me that. So that must be, I don't think they are lying. And I can't make that assumption. But, I think arrangement can be different. So some people may get, for example, minimum wage plus whatever that kilos that they have picked so far, then that would be added. But that still is, that less than. But so I think it depends on the situation. So in that sense, yes, some people may well get paid, but people that I've met and spoken to, they have expressed that concern that certain estates may not be as good as others that you mentioned. So
just one more. You mentioned EPF and ETF.
Yeah.
Now, the government estates have not paid the EPF and the ETF. Have they made any comments about that to you?
Well, very good question. Again, this has been raised a couple of days ago, and also this has been raised this morning when we had a briefing. Well, the government has said that they have taken actions against the private estates. I think there's like 1,400 lawsuits being filed, I think, and I think they've been able to compel 3 companies that recover about like 1 million, which is a good step. But unfortunately, they didn't say anything about that government-owned. And I think there might be an issue, as you rightly say, sir, because I've also we visited both state and the private estates while we were in Kandy. And so I think so there might be a scope to improve in that regard, because I've also spoken to workers, retired workers, and saying we haven't received anything for past 15 years, and there's something wrong in that scenario. One where it may be an administrative error, but if you have to wait for 15 years, what do you have to do? And I've spoken to some workers, and they said, yeah, they have to go back to work. And I think that may happen if they don't have any other support. So I think, I'll be, pressing that once again, clarifying that with the government. So, but thank you for raising that, and I think that's a very good point there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This is not a question, but a clarification. Mr. Tomoya, sorry, but Mr. Steve, I completely disagree with the point you brought out, saying that the exchange of sex work where microfinancing is concerned is more of an issue in the Middle East. I think that sort of statement completely invalidates the awful experiences that our women go through, and I feel like that's a harmful ideology to express. And also about the target setting, where in the plantation sector, what we need to understand is these are families of 5, sometimes 6. We have to remember that these are families with no access to family planning either. So they often have more children than the status quo. So there's about 8 people, sometimes depending on 1,000 rupees per day, which I think we can all agree is not enough at all. So I believe those 2 points sort of make the waters murky where rights for these people are concerned and are not ideologies that should be promoted. I just wanted to make that statement, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Tomoya, can I go ahead? Okay. I just have a couple of questions.
Is it possible to introduce yourself and where you come from?
Right, okay. I'm Hassan from MTV News First. My first question to you is that children in Sri Lanka do have the option of going to school until the age of 18, but Sri Lanka's minimum age for labor stands at 16. Yeah. How important would it be for Sri Lanka to increase the minimum age for labor up to 18 so that children can enjoy full education? And my second question, let me just finish it off. You stated the presence of trade unions as a very positive feature, but you said that trade unions are fighting for the rights of workers. Don't you think that it is more of a negative thing because the government hasn't proactively come forward and resolved these problems? Because if they had done, then the trade unions wouldn't have to fight for the rights of workers, isn't it?
Thank you for that question. First of all, raising that age to 18, if that happens, I think Sri Lanka could be among the most advanced. If you were talking about guaranteeing the compulsory education to 18, as not many countries actually do it. So I think if they can do that, then I think I very much commend it. But 16 is, I think it's a good starting point. I think in line with other countries in the world. For example, in my country, Japan, I come from Japan, I think the compulsory is up to around 16. So, and then other students have a freedom to go to vocational school or university and things like that. So, but, I agree. I think, if you can guarantee the education to as many children as possible without, the key here is without discrimination. So, that should be provided to all. So that I've also seen some instances of the quality of education for certain sectors of society which may not be up to the standard compared to others. And that tells me that the education perhaps is not, again, the quality, the definition of quality may be different depending on where you go. But I mean, that's not just a problem in this country, and that happens elsewhere. But I think that's something that the international community can also read and lead to address it. And second question about that, yes, trade unions, if the government has been guaranteeing these rights, certainly, I mean, that there would be no need for trade unions. But I mean, I think sometimes, I mean, again, not just limited to Sri Lanka, but it's always nice to have a scope for, you know, that as the time progresses, there's lots of different issues. And I think it's always nice to have the voice in the middle who can stand up, who, you know, trade unions could be for people who actually can't stand up for themselves, and, you know, the voice. So in that regard, and I think it's still necessary, you know, again, organizations such as trade unions or civil society organizations are highly you know, effective. But you know, I do agree. So government health and social care are much, much different. It may be more difficult, particularly if you live in remote areas. So that's why I think the government has to work twice as hard to reach out to these most marginalized. And you know, I do agree with that, and be it Sri Lanka or elsewhere, other countries. But yes, I think the government is kind of increasing. For example, they have just introduced mobile units from the Ministry of Labor, where, you know, all these small offices are reaching out to these remote areas. And I do think if that works effectively, that is to be commended. And I'd like to see more of these efforts reaching out to the, you know, women, ethnic minorities, children, young people are also suffering from, you know, all of these things. A second question, Army officers, this militarization of the workforce. I mean, whereby some of the retired officers are working in, for example, as managers in you know, companies and so on. Now, as a human rights lawyer, and I do believe that everyone has a right to work, and that also applies to retired, you know, officers from different army, because I mean, yeah, as I understand it, some of them retired at 44, and if you want to have a comfortable retirement, certainly they have to work longer, and I totally accept that. But what's important then is some of this military culture and so on not imposed on the private sector. As this is where I see a potential conflict. And I've spoken to a number of workers, civil society organizations, and trade unions, which actually, frankly, most of them are saying the exact same thing. And once again, some of the managers are great, I'm sure, but I've heard instances of, and I've also spoken to the business community actually yesterday, and they have introduced, for example, a transition program so that those retired, you know, the military personnel can transition from that life to the civilian life. And something like that happens in different companies. I think that's fine. It's not an issue, but I've heard allegations, for example, of harassment and sometimes threatening behavior, saying, I used to work for the military. If you report this and that may happen. And it may be that these are sporadic. I'm not at all suggesting this is endemic or widespread. No, I'm not saying that at all. But I think there is something to be said about that, you know, working together so that the workers and other sectors of society, such as trade unions and civil society sectors, do not have to feel, you know, be fearful. And this culture of fear seems to be a kind of key word that I've been hearing all along. And sorry, this third question I didn't quite understand. Could you repeat that again?
You mentioned that you have met activists, or trade union activists, human rights activists. So what were the discussions or the reports or observations that you have received? And also, have you noticed that during even within the pandemic, all those restrictions are also restricting the people's right? So do you have any observations on that?
Well,
and so one more question.
Yeah.
So you met with Foreign Minister Professor GL. So have you mentioned all these that you have mentioned in the reports, or have you done any discussion with the minister about on this regard? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so basically you're talking about restricting the activities. That's what you're asking?
No, during the pandemic or
Yes, well, I mean, obviously national lockdowns and so on have made it difficult to, for civil society and other organizations to work. And that's across all countries, not just Sri Lanka. And so that unfortunately might have led to, for example, if you're already victims in domestic work and these people have not been able to be identified, because it's lockdown, no one can leave home. So these people continue to be exploited and abused. And that happens not just here, but elsewhere. I've done quite a bit of research on that one in different parts of the world. But I have spoken to a number of organizations, and one of the issues then was that sometimes the quarantine law might have been used to restrict the activities of some of these entities. And then that becomes an issue, because you may be using that as a kind of weapon to restrict their, for example, freedom of movement, freedom of expression and assembly. And so, but assembly, I think there might be, to an extent, might be restricted because it's in order to spread, in order to stop the spread of a virus. I mean, I think that seems to be sensible because I mean, it is one of those human rights which can be kind of limited to an extent in names of public health or public emergencies. So certain degree of restriction on movements is to be understood. But if that goes beyond what is necessary, so the key question is necessity and proportionality. So was the measure being proportionate and necessary? And that depends on the context, I think. And sometimes, obviously, I cannot really say all instances of restrictions are illegal or against the violation. It may be that they are restricting, protecting the public health. But yes, so I did have a kind of a conversation in that regard. And did I answer your question? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Please, again, your name? Yes. And the,
Hello, my name is Minel Fernandez. I work with Al Jazeera. I have two questions. One, there are sort of charges made by human rights activists, by lawyers that represent a lot of these workers in the garment trade and things like that, that a lot of the larger companies, the groups, and also under the BOI, that there's a lot of discrimination against anyone who tries to unionize, that there is a lot of essentially sort of intimidation almost of anyone who tries to organize. And have you heard this from people that you have spoken to? What are your views on essentially worker rights being secured through that kind of activity? That's one question. And very quickly, my second question. What do you make of the Sri Lankan labor laws as they stand? There are some that date back a long time. They have not been updated as much as there is talk of law reform. Have you been talking to the different stakeholders, and what have you heard from them regarding what the key sort of priorities are in the event that we do undertake law reform?
Thank you for that. The first question about, the threat against unionization. Frankly, yes, I have heard it. I've spoken to a number, as I said, workers, trade unions, and harassment, union busting harassment. This is not necessarily, okay, Constitution guarantees it, right to organize. And there may be other laws, Industrial Dispute Act. There's lots of other legislation that guarantees. So that's on paper. There's a law, but whether that is being enforced is open to question. Because frankly, I did hear from a number of stakeholders, trade unions, workers, and civil society organizations, and sometimes union members being sacked, and so on. But what I cannot say is that this is very systematic and widespread, because I've only looked at certain sectors, so I cannot say that this is a problem across the board. That because I haven't had a chance to look at all sectors. But from what I've heard from the people that I met, yes, I've heard that has been raised as one of the serious issues. Second, labor laws. Yes, as far as I understand it, there are over 30 laws relating to labor issues, and many of them are quite old. And frankly, some of them could be said to be outdated, because what happened, the law enacted like 60, 70 years ago may not actually be relevant now because of the changing situation in the working conditions, wages, and people's values and so on. So I think there is a need to update. There's no question about that, I think. And the government is taking I was encouraged by some of the steps the government is taking to update and modify some of these existing laws. But I also find that quite confusing. And some of the workers and union members are also saying it's confusing. Which law do I need to cite? So I think there may be a scope to streamline labor laws, and I certainly can recommend that as well, in order to make it more simple for workers and trade unions and others to understand. And I think that's always a good thing for simplification. And some of the priorities, and obviously minimum wages, is the priority. I think many workers frankly said, no, it's not enough. Okay, they may get paid more than minimum wage, but if they can't support their family, so they often end up taking second or third jobs in different sectors. So that's not exactly an ideal. So there's a need to regularly monitor and update the minimum wage, working conditions such as, it's take for granted for someone like me living in a Western country, something like a paid holiday or sick leave. We don't think about it because these are automatically granted. But that's not the case in various sectors. Even if the law grants them, that doesn't mean that employers allow them to take holidays. If they do, the bonus are cut. If they do, they do not have access to this and that. So there is, again, I'm not saying this is widespread and systematic problems, but there are lots of good companies, I'm sure, and those companies should be commended. There's no question about it. But there are other rogue companies here and there which actually benefit from cheap labor, make a huge amount of money, and yet none of that is going back to the workers who sacrifice so much and to survive every day. And I think that's an unfortunate situation.
Thank you. Any further questions? Sure. I'll just check if there is someone, anyone in the back. Okay, one last question then. Yes.
Basically, I talk about the plantation sector. The domestic workers who come to Colombo basically work in big cities. The law seems to be a bit weak and bleak. In the sense, these cases are taken up. Recently, there was an incident about a girl set fire. Some say she tried to commit suicide. She committed suicide, and others said she was allegedly set on fire. However, the case went up and it was politicized beyond a point. However, these laws related to these kind of marginal society and vulnerable citizens has been always very vague and not taken up quickly. I wonder whether you heard about this story actually, and was there any reaction from the government about this case?
Are you talking about the domestic work situation?
Yes.
Domestic workers in
what I know is that domestic work has always been at least regulated.
By the age, that age was...
Yeah, age is also, that age regulation is so, also that, they don't have like a paid holiday, or minimum wage is not always guaranteed. It's 500 rupees, but there's no guarantee that they get paid that much money. Even if they do, some of them work part-time, for example, but they are asked to do like 6, 7 days worth of work in 3 days. So that means they have to overwork. So those are the kind of conditions that I have heard from that. I've spoken to a number of domestic workers as well, but I don't know this particular case. Only case that I know is this maid who used to work in the parliament, one of the politicians who was, I think, who was killed or something like that. I don't know if that's the same issue or not. And because, I don't know if it's because of that, but the one positive step the government has taken is to include domestic work as part of the hazardous work. So in theory now, it's been published in Gazette in November, so I'm not sure about the timing or exact enforcement, but if you are under the age of 18, you are not supposed to be working. But whether that is going to be enforced is another question. So these are, I suppose, issues that, and in particular, as you said, these works are occupied by minority populations, and there's something to be said about that. The law is there for everyone. The law should apply equally and on paper, but the way they are enforced may kind of lead to marginalization and discrimination. And it all comes down to, it's not just about law. I think it's more about, for example, lack of access to decent education, and also access to decent work. And all of that are extremely limited in rural areas and also areas dominated by minorities. That's not just limited to this country, but that happens in any other countries. So that I think the task of the government then is to make sure that everyone is included. So my conclusion is that, as you see from your press release, is inclusive society is essential to secure access to decent work and also to eradicate contemporary forms of slavery. If everyone has equal access to decent work, there wouldn't be any problem of contemporary forms of slavery. So I would certainly like to work with the government, Sri Lankan government, to achieve that even more. I don't deny that, the government is taking steps to address many of these issues, but I think there is scope to do more, and I'm always available to work with the government to improve the living and working condition of these workers. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I think we have covered all the questions. All the best, and thanks again for your very active participation. Thank you, Special Rapporteur, for your extensive and very good debriefing. Thank you very much.